This show is sponsored by Liquid IV. What do you pack in your bag when you're heading out for the day? Sunblock? Snacks? Sunglasses? Well, now there's another essential, Liquid IV. Liquid IV is more than just a drink. It's scientifically formulated to hydrate better than water alone. Visit liquidiv.com and stay fueled for a long day with sugar-free hydration featuring the new Raspberry Lemonade Hydration Multiplier. Get 20% off your first order with the code THERACE at checkout. When I'm travelling, I always like to have a pack of Liquid IV on me to help me stay hydrated when I'm getting on and off planes or going to and from the track. It's important for me because when travelling I am prone to suffering from dehydration and cramp if I don't use Liquid IV. Just one stick and 16 ounces of water hydrates better than water alone. It has 3 times the electrolytes of the leading sports drink, plus 8 essential vitamins and nutrients that turn ordinary water into extraordinary hydration. From acai berry and lemon lime to pina colada, there are a wealth of flavours to choose from, and they are always non-GMO, vegan, gluten-free, dairy-free and soy-free. So get ready for a long day with extraordinary hydration from Liquid IV. Get 20% off your first order of Liquid IV when you go to liquidiv.com and use code THERACE at checkout. That's 20% off your first order with code THERACE at liquidiv.com.
This Athletic podcast is sponsored by Shopify. Now, when you think about companies like Skims or Allbirds, they are selling through the roof. Sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand and brilliant marketing, but often the overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, which makes buying and selling simple. And for millions of businesses, that business is Shopify, because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet, and the not-so-secret secret with ShopPay, it boosts conversions by up to 50%. So if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell while your customers are scrolling or strolling on the web or in your store, in their feed and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more on Shopify. So upgrade your business to get the same checkouts used by Skims and Allbirds. Sign up right now for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/theathletic, all in lowercase and with no spaces. Upgrade your selling today at shopify.com/theathletic. That's shopify.com/theathletic.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code THEATHLETIC, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code THEATHLETIC. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code THEATHLETIC and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and Oscar Piastri made it 3 wins out of 5 with victory in Saudi Arabia, as Lando Norris had another disappointing weekend. But was Max Verstappen robbed by his 5-second penalty for the first corner cut? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to tell all are Scott Mitchell-Malm and John Noble, with little help from Mark Hughes. Well, Scott, hello, how are you? I've not been with you all weekend, obviously, so how's it been?
Yeah, excellent pretense. Good to see you, Ed. Where have you been in Jeddah?
Oh, you know, here and there, everywhere.
I'm good, yeah. The race was fairly straightforward with obviously a big flashpoint at the start, and I've been surprised actually by just how much it split opinion afterwards. But yeah, it was a relatively smooth Grand Prix overall. Still have our 100% safety car record here in Jeddah. But yeah, mainly just pleased to have got through the weekend without being killed by anybody on the buggies outside the media centre and between the paddock, because we might be 5 editions into the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix here in Jeddah, but this felt like going back right the way to year one with the sort of disorganisation and just sort of low-level peril that involved every time you wanted to walk across to the paddock.
Yes, there's some there's some bits that are very well organised, some bits that are very poorly organised. John, you told some good stories on our Patreon podcast last night about the buggies, but other than that, how's the weekend been?
Quite fun, actually. It's been quite a good one of newsy in the paddock. Some interesting developments. Obviously, it's all going to kick off this week over F1 26 engines. We thought that chapter had been closed in Bahrain just 7 days ago when they had the engine meeting. Everyone thought that we'll get 26 rolling, then we'll decide what happens, but it's not played out like that. There's a big change coming potentially on the radar for next year to be discussed next week. Opinions divided in the paddock. The politics are out in the open. So I think it's been fun off the track in the paddock, and I thought the race was all right for a 2025 Grand Prix. I think we're into a year of dirty air, a year where qualifying is really important, but it doesn't mean it's dull because the gaps between the cars are so small, and we're still going to each weekend, still not knowing who's going to be in front.
And of course, we had some controversy in this race as well, and that's where we're going to start, Scott, because the big story was that 5-second penalty Max Verstappen was hit with for passing Oscar Piastri off the track after being jumped at the start. We'll offer our opinions on it in a moment, but it was clear that both team and driver didn't feel it was a justified penalty. What's their argument? And why exactly was it a penalty?
Well, we don't know what Max's argument is specifically because he was very, very, very deliberate in what he said afterwards, which was essentially that he couldn't give his real opinion because he might get a penalty for it, which I think was a reference to the fact that you can get pinged for swearing, but also, as he referenced, there are all sorts of rules relating to insulting or causing injury to officials and whatnot. So I suspect that meant if Max spoke his mind, he'd have had some choice words to say about it. But Red Bull boss Christian Horner made it very clear where Red Bull stands because I was in his media session and he came out armed, as he has done a couple of times before, with some supporting evidence. In this case, a printout of, and you'll see it, we've put it on social media and it's on the website as well, of a different camera angle on board of Verstappen's car going into turn one with side by side with Piastri. There was an on board, obviously, from the world feed, which you'd have seen at the time and plenty of replays of. And the Red Bull argument is that Verstappen got far enough alongside and actually ahead of Piastri by the middle of the corner, and therefore the corner was his. He should have been given room. He wasn't given room, and he was forced off and went wide. That's kind of the simplest way of summarising the Red Bull position. The reason that didn't stack up is because actually I think that image, which Red Bull wanted the FIA to take a proper look at, but they weren't willing to go as far as trying to petition for a right of review, which I think says probably enough about whether or not Red Bull really felt that this would be a strong enough case. But let's see what happens as we record this podcast. Maybe I'm about to stitch us up massively and some news will drop. I don't think that's going to come that way. As far as the stewards are concerned, basically it all matters. It's really about what happens just a couple of milliseconds just before that in the sequence of events, which is basically where they are at the apex. We talk about this a lot. It's all about apex positioning for starters. Piastri had done everything he needed to make the corner his own. He was in control. He was far enough alongside, and actually alongside Verstappen at what the stewards deemed to be the apex. He didn't deliberately force Verstappen off the track, and he kept his own car within the confines of the circuit. What Verstappen did by releasing the brakes effectively, carrying in too much speed, in the steward's opinion, I believe, to make it round the corner on his own, constituted not being forced off by Piastri, and in addition, booting the throttle and rejoining on the other side with about a second's advantage was more than just keeping the place. That was, in addition, gaining a lasting advantage, which is why ultimately the stewards ruled in Piastri's favour and punished Verstappen.
Good explanation. John, do you want to be the first to offer your opinion? Was it the right penalty? Should he have been penalised?
I think sometimes in these situations, I think you've got to sometimes think what would have happened if there was a crash barrier alongside the circuit, because in theory you're supposed to do all your racing within the circuit. We have a thing called track limits. You're not supposed to do any passing over the track, and I think if there had been a barrier there, then there's no way Max would have taken the same approach going into that corner. The position was lost. Piastri had made the much better start, had done enough to get into the inside to claim the corner, and I think as a driver on the outside, you're always at the behest of what the guy on the inside is going to be doing in terms of his control of the situation. It's something Max well knows, because there's been countless times he's been the one on the inside and made life difficult for the one on the outside. And I think if you go into turn one, arguably alongside your competitor, and then you come out with a pretty healthy lead because you've booted it across the runoff area, I think the outcome's fairly obvious that it's probably not you probably have gained an advantage, arguably. So I think in the end the penalty was right. I think the 10-second would have been harsh because it's one of those things. But I also do feel slightly uncomfortable. I know this kind of transition they've had to not advising people to give positions back and stuff. I personally don't like it. I would much prefer a situation where race control says drivers, you can give the position back. We believe you should do it, and give them that option, rather than leave it up to them and then suddenly it goes to the stewards and it's a penalty, because we get trapped in this world too often, I think.
But I also think it should be within the steward's remit for a steward's verdict to swap the positions back. And if you have subsequently gained a further advantage by overtaking other cars, well, so be it. Obviously, that didn't apply in this case, but it might somewhere else in the field. If you've gone from 7th to 4th or whatever, for example, why isn't it an option for the stewards? I actually think that would be quite a valid thing for them to have in their arsenal, down with time penalties, which we constantly argue are either meaningless or too harsh, or if you get one and there's a safety car finish or something like that, like Melbourne, I think it was a few years ago, for example, they would eradicate all of that, wouldn't it? You just fall behind the car that you've booted out. It wouldn't be perfect, but I think you could apply it in certain situations. Everything happens at the steward's discretion anyway, so I just think that would be a neat way of doing it, and it would have reset the board quite nicely here, because you'd have had then Verstappen right on Piastri's tail for at the resumption of the Grand Prix, or right after. And
it's better for racing as well, because one of the dangers of handing out 5-second penalties is teams and drivers can game the system, because you've got this 5-second buffer. So if you think, actually, I'm much better off being aggressive, taking the 5 seconds and just gunning it, which is probably in Max's head, than it is you've got to give the position back and be second. I think if Max had been told, give that position back, you've got to be second, I think the arguments wouldn't be as emotional now, because everything would have reset. Max would have been second, could potentially have tried the undercut in the race if the pace was there, and could actually have come out and won the race. That's not an impossible scenario based on the pace of those cars. So I think it's a sporting spectacle. I think maybe this is something that should be looked at in terms of the stewards. If it goes to the stewards and they say you can have the option of giving the place back, or if it's not done in 3 laps, you get your penalty.
We've got a few questions coming up about that, but just to finish the discussion on the opinion, for me, I was happy with it being a penalty. I don't see how racing works if that move is allowed to happen, because you can just barrel in with a load of speed, try and get to a point where you tick the box for being alongside, which I think what Max was trying to do, and Piastri's just stuck, and so that's why I think it's perfectly reasonable. Scott, were you happy with the penalty?
Yeah, I think so. I think we talk a lot about whether or not penalties are always necessary in modern racing. It always feels like someone has to cop it, but I think when you have something like that, and to a point that John's been mentioning, when you have this this prominence of track position now, and the impact of dirty air and how close the lead cars all are, I don't think you can have it where you just sort of shrug it and say, win some, lose some. Like, if it's a proper 50-50 racing incident, that is still within the steward's discretion to rule on. Something like this, I do feel was one that that's why I said it surprised me that it was quite as contentious and controversial and seemed to split opinion in the way that it did, because we've seen other stuff before that has been a lot more kind of on the fence in terms of whether it should or shouldn't have resulted in a penalty. But I thought this was fine, just like I thought it was fine, because some people think you should have got the full 10 seconds because that's what you're meant to get. But I was also fine with the leniency of the fact that it was turn 1 and the first lap.
Well, there's a few questions from the Race Members Club we sort of touched on some of them. There was one from Scuderia Irish, Ross Stevenson, Troy Lulian, Ed, John, who basically asked whether the 5-second penalty was enough and why it wasn't a 10-second penalty, given F1 appeared to have got rid of 5-second penalties. They kind of rolled back on those a little bit, but in that circumstance, 5 made sense, didn't it?
Yeah, so we had this change where penalties were going to be put to 10 seconds, I think primarily to stop people gaming the system, because 5 seconds was often not enough to make a difference, because people were utilising it, and it wasn't having a big enough impact. And 10 seconds is a pretty big deterrent. But then I think common sense has prevailed. There are a few common sense decisions being made these days. That 10 seconds for some offences is too much. And I think 5 seconds was right. It was the first lap. You got to take that into account. Things are very close, and it's not the kind of scenario. And I think Scott is absolutely spot on. You can't let that one go and be nothing. You can't arrive at turn one with the guy who's pulled alongside you, claimed a right to a corner, and then you come out of the corner not only ahead but further ahead than you were at any point previously. So, I think common sense, first lap incident, common sense to roll it back, and I think common sense also that not everything should be 10 seconds.
It's got a question from Dharma Straz. Did Verstappen just get Verstappen? When was the last time that someone beat Max at his own game like this?
A little bit. I certainly think if the roles were reversed, Max would have thought it was ludicrous that the other person had cut the track and would be screaming for a penalty himself. But I think Verstappen himself, in that this is a move he's pulled before at this track, and he's pulled it at a couple of others as well. He is a driver who pushes the rules as he interprets them to the absolute limit. He'll make the absolute most that he can out of a track layout, out of his rival's position, out of his car positioning. It's standard fare for Verstappen to do that trick of releasing the brake and making sure that he gets far enough alongside to claim the corner, either as the rules demand it or as it suits him to then be able to do what he wants with the other car. Now, different people have different views on that. Some people think that it's hard but fair. Some people think that it's very unfair. Some people think it's a bit dark artsy. I don't think there's one blanket description to describe the way that Verstappen races when he's like this. But I think what you can say is that because he is so uncompromising in situations like this, and I think he will pretty much without exception always be tempted into that more aggressive move because he wants to be in control, and he's very good at taking control of situations. And especially when you have that added premium on track position, as we've already talked about, then maybe I think Verstappen leaves himself a little bit vulnerable to this kind of thing where it becomes make or break when it maybe doesn't need to be. Because I think it wouldn't have been the end of the world, actually, in hindsight, and with the benefit of hindsight, that's very easy to say. He had come out of turn one right behind Oscar Piastri. That's actually would have played out as it played out. Probably would have been better than getting halfway through the race and coming out of a pit stop 3 seconds behind Piastri or whatever that exact gap was at the time. So maybe it's not that he's his own worst enemy or whatever, but just maybe sometimes Max sort of hurts himself by being in that situation. Whereas if he did just say, actually, do you know what? Okay, he's got me on this occasion. Slot in where you can, live to fight another day. That's what different drivers have different approaches, don't they? Max isn't that kind of I'll just live to fight another day driver, especially when he thinks that could be the deciding moment. He made a judgment call, didn't he? He was like, this is where the race will be won or lost. If I'm going to win it, I'm going to win it here. And unfortunately, it was where he lost it.
Next question I'll take is a bit of a mashup. Tristan 1-4 and Christian Johansson said, asked why Verstappen and Piastri weren't swapped during the safety car and if the stewards should have just waited until after the restart to give Verstappen a chance to reverse positions. Justin Coffin asked why lap one leniency didn't apply. Michael Sanderson asked why the FIA is less willing to instruct drivers to give a place back. While Steve S said, is there a practical way to take a decision on place swapping out of the hands of teams and force the swap? A similar question from Professor Gratz too. So to skip through that, they weren't swapped during the safety car because it would be down to Red Bull and Verstappen to do that. They didn't want to do that, hence they didn't swap. They weren't going to wait because it was pretty clear they weren't going to swap. I think that was fairly obvious, so they took action. I think lap one leniency did apply, otherwise it may have been a 10-second penalty potentially.
It would have been. Yeah, definitely.
So I think that was reflected in the 5 second. The FIA actually never instructed drivers to give a place back, and this relates to the last bit about if there's a practical way. What used to happen is you could get on the phone, as it were, to Charlie Whiting and say, what do you think? And he could give you an advisory, or he could advise you to do it. But the FIA, the race director, is not the stewards. He could give advice, they could follow it, and then get done anyway. And teams objected to this because it wasn't absolute. So basically they said, right, well, we'll stop advising, you decide, or you'll get a penalty. And the reason they can't make it so the stewards do it all the time is every single team and driver will take liberties. They'll stay ahead unless they're told to drop back, and that'll just cause chaos. there has to be some responsibility on teams and drivers, and they never want to take it. They always want to blame the FIA and stewards for it, and that's why you've got this situation. So I think it's a reasonable approach, because the teams have the chance to make the swap to avoid getting the penalty. That's the mechanism. It's not that they have to be told. Now, the one thing I would say is you could allow the stewards to have just give the place back punishment. That would be okay. The 5-second penalty is sort of that. So maybe there's an argument for that. That's the one thing I think you could say that there's an argument for. We do see that in IndyCar, for example. Right, John, Charlie Pascoe says, what do you think bothered Max more, losing the lead due to Piastri having the better launch, or the penalty that he received for keeping P1 off track?
I think the penalty at the end, because I'm sure bad starts were annoying. Obviously, it opened the door for Oscar, and he'll be semi-kicking himself. But I mean, the penalty is the thing that ultimately cost him the race, because the bad start he could have recovered from. Scott says if he'd come out of turn 1 in second place, I think the race win was still on the cards for him. I think the pace of Red Bull was quick today. Dirty air was a problem, but based on tyre life, based on where he would have been, based on where Piastri's tyres faded, they could have pulled off the undercut and tried something today. So I think he would have given himself a shout. The 5-second penalty got rid of all of that. And I think in his head he will calculate that I did this race on a day the McLaren were worse on tyres. I was leading. I was able to extend the first stint. Came out in the pits, managed to close out the gap on the second stint. And my calculations are the 5 seconds cost me X. I didn't finish that far ahead. Therefore, the 5 seconds cost me the win. That's what he was frustrated about. That's why I didn't want to talk about it after the race. And that's the thing that will continue to annoy him for a little bit, I'm sure.
I agree that the penalty is the one with the bigger consequences, but the first order problem was Max's start, which Christian Horner described as average and said that Piastri had a good one. And it's interesting because it's not my place to say whether or not this is part of the reason for making such a big fuss about it, but it has definitely turned the attention away from the fact that Max got beaten off the line. And it wasn't just Oscar got just about a better start to then send it into turn 1. He was ahead. That was it. And it's not a massively long run to the first corner here. I think Max is where he is, and Red Bull has had the success it's had as a team because they do focus on weak areas. So what they shouldn't allow to happen as a result of this is to just be like, oh, the penalty is so unfair, that's what screwed us. I think they should drill down into the fact that the only reason he was in that position was because the start wasn't good enough, and that'll be something that they want to improve for future races.
Well, the next question, this was another combined one. The bit from Scott Kleinclass, I think you've already answered about whether he should have dropped back and run the race from there. But the Ferrari Fan Club podcast asked why Verstappen didn't just hand the place back, and is he too entitled to see the benefits to the team of doing so?
Well, Christian Horner was asked about this and just said they didn't think Verstappen had done anything wrong and therefore shouldn't have been given a penalty. So you're not going to give the place back, because otherwise you're willfully forfeiting a lead that you might not be forced out of. Personally, I think that that's a little bit of a cover for the fact that even if Red Bull wanted to get Max to hand the place back, I don't think Max would. And I don't think it's necessarily about being entitled or anything like that. I can just see in that scenario Max feeling so aggrieved by the notion, because he seemed so it didn't come across to me anyway like Max doing that thing where you put on appearances a little bit and be like, oh, I've been forced off, even though you're in the... Like, Max did seem to think it was genuinely egregious. So I don't think Max would necessarily have it in him to just take that. Well, that's like, it's similar to the mindset that I talked about just accept that you've been beaten into the corner. Like, he kind of can't do that, and then I don't think he will do that afterwards. We've seen before, in certain circumstances, he will eventually yield, and he will give the place back if he's absolutely forced to. So it's not like he never ever does it. I'm just not 100% sure he would have done it on this occasion, just based on how he reacted to the penalty.
Question now from Christopher Partridge, who said Verstappen said on the radio that they wouldn't penalise anyone for going off on turn 1 as per the driver's briefing. Do you think that he used that to his advantage, not suspecting he would get a penalty for gaining that advantage? I only heard it once at the time, but I think that radio message was just about the track cut and the potential for that adding up to a penalty?
I believe so, and also that was a slightly incorrect message that Verstappen was given as well, because it didn't count towards his strikes. The lap time was deleted, and that's what came across on the race control board, but because he was penalised for the incident, it didn't count as one of his track cuts.
Right, John, the final question. Combination again from Yannis van der Waal asked, is Max not a sore loser? after his penalties. He did this often to Hamilton in 2021. Daniel Janowski said in 2018, Max said he didn't need to change his approach to driving, but in the end he did. Is it possible for him to realise he needs to take another step to avoid these types of penalties? And Nathan Schwartz says, I know racing drivers have big egos and hate coming second, but does Max Verstappen's pouting at being, in my opinion, fairly penalised show that even after 10 seasons and 4 championships, he still has room to grow? Is it just the way he is and may always be?
It's quite amusing. This evening we had Jonathan Wheatley, now Audi team boss, but former Red Bull sporting manager. I think I can't remember his official team manager, sporting manager, whatever his official title was. He was asked about here because back in 2021, if you remember, I think the first restart, it was Max and Lewis on the front row. Max attempted to go around the outside of Lewis into turn 1. And very, very similar scenario. Basically, Lewis did today what had his car roughly where Piastri's car was positioned all the way out onto the curb on the exit and the apex of turn 2. Max ran wide, much less than he did today, but that was enough for a penalty at the time, famously, because we can remember that conversation between Michael Massey and Wheatley. So Wheatley was asked tonight what his opinion was on what would he have done if he was still at Red Bull. He'd have said, I'd have told him to give the position back. So I think that's a lesson from the past. But that's, someone who sits in the pit wall can see the big picture and understands precedent and punishments and how things work at the FIA and race control. I think from Max's perspective, he is just this animal that wants to win all the time and doesn't want to give an inch. He's in a championship fight with a car that's not the quickest. He knows that the racing is tough this year. The margins are very small between teams. There's a dirty air problem. If you get trapped behind someone else, the race is effectively lost. I think I'd come into this race feeling that the McLaren, if Piastri ever got ahead of him, then it was game over, that Piastri was going to disappear into the distance. I think Scott mentioned earlier when we were chatting that Christian Horner had said in his session today that McLaren's pace here on Friday was insane. We know in the heat they've been so strong. It didn't turn out to be the case today. That'll be an interesting one to kind of dig into what happened. But I think Max felt if he gave any inch to Piastri today, any potential for him to get ahead, the race was lost. And I think that's why he did what he did at turn 1, because he's a ruthless animal who will do whatever it takes to win, and he will take the rules and the grey areas and everything to the absolute limit to do it. And it makes him have days like today, but it also makes him an extreme, supreme, brilliant winner on other days too.
I look forward to the aggregator accounts, ignoring all of the context around that. It was actually quite complimentary from John towards Verstappen, and just seeing the quote that Verstappen's a monster and a ruthless animal going around social media by the morning.
You've saved some people some work there by clipping it out there.
I run the aggregator accounts, so...
Okay, it's all your secret identities. Yeah, but this will be talked about for ages, and we had loads of questions about it, so we really wanted to get in depth onto it in the first part of this podcast. Right, we've got a long way into this podcast, only having discussed about the first 10 or 15 seconds of the race, so probably have to pick up the pace. It's over to Mark Hughes now for his explanation of how the race was won.
Well, obviously the turn 1 incident and the penalty, which you've already talked about, determined the shape of the race up front, with Verstappen leading the first stint, but losing the lead with the penalty at the stops, and then not getting any closer to Piastri who, after coming out behind him, and Piastri able to keep him well off his back and really just judging his pace back to the gap to the Red Bull. What was significant was that Verstappen's pace in that first stint was better than Piastri's after about 10 laps, despite this being the sort of thermal deg race in which McLaren usually shines. I think what's clear is that this track imposes a much bigger penalty even than normal for dirty air, and we see that in the pattern of performance between Piastri and Verstappen, comparing their respective first stints. Whoever was ahead had comfortably more pace, and it looked like Piastri was actually keeping something in hand in that second pace, judging by that last lap that he did. But we saw it also in the Russell versus Leclerc battle, which was ultimately won by Leclerc. Russell was trying to stay with Verstappen early on, and the Mercedes just didn't have the pace to do that, and basically got its tyres into a runaway thermal degradation. Stopping early to be off those tyres then gave Leclerc, who had been suffering understeer in the Ferrari, suddenly had a beautiful balance. He not caned the tyres, he just sat 2 to 3 seconds behind George, but as soon as he got clean air, he found the car beautifully balanced. Now, the Ferrari was better on its tyres here than the Mercedes, but the way each driver drove those first stints played a big part in that as well. Leclerc says he's never been happier with the balance of this car than it was in the race and when in clean air today. And this allowed him to run super long on the original mediums, giving him a 9-lap newer tyres than Russell when both had switched to the hard for stint 2. And as George pushed, trying to keep a gap on the Ferrari so his tyres blistered front and rear, made him easy meat for Leclerc. But as Charles said, the reason the Ferrari looked good today was that they had the best tyre deck, not because they had the best car. It's still lacking downforce, and that's why they're qualifying where they are. So into that mix, we had Norris starting from his 10th position, starting on the hards, running long. They're only 5 laps longer than Leclerc did on his mediums. He picked off Hamilton and Antonelli in the first stint, and that late stop gave him the faster medium tyre with a big tyre age offset as well to those around him, and he was then able to get by the limping Russell and close right up on Leclerc. It took him a couple of laps too long to reach Leclerc because of the delay choosing the wrong part of the track to pass Hamilton on earlier on in the first stint, enabling Hamilton to retaliate with DRS for a couple of laps.
Great stuff there from Mark, as always. Right, John, we've done a lot of talking about Lando Norris of late, and there is more to come. But Oscar Piastri has now won 3 out of 5 Grand Prix. He leads the championship by 10 points. How big a marker has he laid down, title-wise?
I'm not convinced it's a marker today, in effect, but I think he has confirmed his step forward from last year. He's confirmed he's consistent. I think he's confirmed that there aren't many weaknesses now in Oscar Piastri like we saw last season. He's found the speed in qualifying. He's found the speed in the weekends that don't especially start off super strong. He seems to have that ability to bounce back. He's shown he's absolutely willing to take it wheel to wheel with Max Verstappen, which is something you're going to have to do if you're going to win a world championship. So I think everything's still open to play for. Lando's had his wobbles. Oscar had a wobble in Australia. So I think it's premature to instill him as the automatic favourite so far. I think there's a lot of ground to go. But I think we can say the mark has been laid down that Oscar Piastri has what it takes to fight for this world championship.
What I'm interested in by this weekend is I think Piastri, for the first time, I think he's won a race on his bad day. I think this is his first bad day of the season, first bad weekend of the season, and he started on the front row and won the race because I think he was the second best McLaren driver this weekend, or second fastest McLaren driver this weekend, and he wasn't even quite on Verstappen's level in the Red Bull. And yes, this was a much more competitive showing from Red Bull. It was more like Japan, and this is a track a bit more like Suzuka, where the driver, when they're really on it, can make more of a difference. But it was the first time, I think, this season where we've seen Oscar just like missing that little tenth and a half to Lando. But he hasn't made the mistake in qualifying. He's pulled it together enough to be on the front row. He's absolutely aced the start. He's not been bullied by Verstappen through turn 1. And even though he wasn't stunningly fast thereafter, not compared to Verstappen, and came under a little bit of pressure towards the end, dealing with some back markers as well. And I don't think it didn't sound, he wasn't panicking or anything like that, but that's the closest you'll come to hearing a little bit of tension in Oscar's voice when he's over the radio. That's the most under pressure I think he's been so far this year. And he's come through with a win. And what have we been saying about when Norris has erred slightly? His off days are too far off. But that and maybe this is on the point of, laying down a marker. That is what a world champion does. Not just getting a good result on your bad day, getting the best result on your bad day. It makes your bad day such a relative term.
Absolutely. And yeah, it was a bad day for him, but it wasn't a bad weekend in terms of delivery and getting the result out of it. And that's what you absolutely have to do. It's not a criticism. What you've just laid out, it's very much a positive.
His bad days last year were being 20, 30 seconds off Norris in the race and being out-qualified by 3-4 tenths and being 4 rows behind him on the grid. That's not the case anymore. His bad day, this is his first time where he's a tenth and a half is missing.
If I look at the first 5 races as a whole, I would say the question coming into the season was, could he take that next step? And I feel like although the sample set still isn't as big as it needs to be, it feels like he's taken 2 steps in one. It's almost like it's 4th season Oscar Piastri now, and that's going to make him formidable. And Norris is still in this, very, very much so. But Piastri's basically said, look, I'm not going to be up and down too much. I'm going to get points every weekend and be in this fight.
There's also a tiny little interesting backstory that Andrea Stella told us tonight about just the way that the 2 drivers and 2 sides of the garage are operating, and that we saw Lando had his difficulties today overtaking Lewis Hamilton. He kind of mismanaged the DRS activation zones, so found himself overtaking, then being repassed. So lost some laps, which could arguably, you can say cost him the podium. Finished that time he lost. Potentially could have got him onto the back of Leclerc earlier and he could have finished 3rd. So as Piastri also had to clear Lewis after the stops. So obviously there was a risk that he would do it, but we saw on the TV instantly, straight past him, doesn't hesitate. Beforehand, Norris's engineer Will Joseph was messaging Piastri's side of the garage, just saying, just to remind you that we had this problem with the DRS zone. Make sure Oscar doesn't fall to the same trap. Warn him that he needs to, if he's going to pass him in that area of the DRS, make sure it's doesn't leave himself exposed into turn 1. So I think it's just a sign that they may be fighting for the World Championship, those 2 sides of the garage, but there's still a level of kind of cooperation and common sense there.
I'm not convinced Piastri would have needed telling, and I don't think he would have needed telling twice. That was the thing that frustrated me when Norris was struggling with Hamilton. Is kind of he did sort of clock it the second time, and then got caught out by the fact that Hamilton was also being careful in front of him to make sure that they managed it the right way. But it felt a little bit too laboured, in much the same way as in Bahrain. Obviously, in the race there were a couple of questionable moments in terms of Norris's racecraft. So it's kind of 2 weekends in a row he's trying to make ground up past cars he should be in front of, and he's just not quite doing it as efficiently as he should. And I think if he'd played his recovery perfectly today, he could have been 3rd. Still think he did a good job, but this was for obvious reasons, a weekend. It's a big missed opportunity for Norris, because this isn't Bahrain where it's like, okay, you should have been 2nd today, you weren't 2nd. He should have won this Grand Prix.
Yeah, he dropped the ball in qualifying, didn't he? And this will be added to those who subscribe to the Lando's not up to it and he hasn't got the mentality of a champion, he keeps making mistakes, will say this is conclusive proof of it. Others won't. But it was an interesting weekend, wasn't it, Scott? Because he was very, very, very quick. And that's the thing I think he can latch onto. Racing drivers crash. I would be more concerned, as Lando seemed to be, about the weekend he had in Bahrain than this one.
Yeah, definitely. The only thing is, it does create this slightly odd quirk that he's still, I think he still hasn't out-qualified Oscar Piastri in Jeddah. I think this has always been a relative Piastri stronghold. So there's that side of things, but you can look at it the other way around and say, this is a place where Norris has, quote-unquote, struggled, in the last few years, and he was actually on it this weekend. He was super, super fast. And that's why I think he handled it so much better on Saturday after the crash compared to how much he was criticising himself and laying into himself in Bahrain. So, yeah, overall, I would say, it's a completely different track layout. So the stuff that he was struggling with his driving in Bahrain isn't necessarily fixed. But I think he comes away from here in much better spirits than he did, in terms of the Bahrain weekend.
And ultimately, the first 5 events haven't been all plain sailing for him. He's only 10 points down, so it's, this stage of the season, that's almost nothing.
You wouldn't have picked this, though, would you? Pre-season, no. 5 races in, 3 wins for Oscar and that championship lead. And also Verstappen being in that, quite in such close proximity in 3rd. I actually think it sets it up fascinating after this burst of 5 races in 6 weeks. I think it's been really interesting. Yeah,
very much so. Well, Mark explained, moving on to Ferrari versus Mercedes, how Leclerc came through to beat Russell. That reversed the form of qualifying. So do you know what went wrong for Mercedes, Scott?
Just an absolute tyre nightmare. But they don't really know why. They just know they struggled really badly, blistering very badly on Russell's side. Antonelli's pace seemed to come back towards the very end of the Grand Prix. So I don't know if his was more graining related and then it sort of cleared up a little bit more. I haven't, as we sit and record this, haven't quite looked into it in that much detail. But speaking to Toto Wolff after the race, he was admitting obviously it was their worst performance so far and they didn't have any obvious answers. And what was extra frustrating is they sort of went into it budgeting for a deficit to McLaren, especially off the back of how Friday had gone. But they weren't expecting Ferrari and Red Bull in particular to go with McLaren. And it was just Mercedes just nosedived over the course of the race relative to the top 3 teams. It wasn't just to McLaren. And I think that's what's confused them and to use Wolf's word, frustrated them even more than just a bad performance and bad result.
Yeah, you'd have to say they were very much, I was going to say fifth best, not fifth best, fourth best of the top 4 in the race, which is strange.
They still don't have to worry about being fifth best. This is very much a 2-class F1 at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, very, very much so. But it was interesting given that Russell looked so good on tyre management on Friday. Just shows how much things can turn around. Lewis Hamilton obviously had a very bad weekend. We've got a question coming up about him later, but yeah, he was fairly miserable. Well, he was very miserable after Friday practice, fairly miserable after qualifying, fairly miserable after the race. Obviously finished down in 7th place behind Antonelli with George Russell in 5th. Now, John, the midfield battle was effectively decided by the first lap collision between Pierre Gasly and Yuki Tsunoda because it removed Alpine from the equation, left the way clear for Williams pairing Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon to finish 8th and 9th without Gasly making a nuisance of himself. But who was at fault for that collision?
Yeah, I mean, Pierre was quite aggressive and ambitious to make a move there. It's super fast, super tight on the first lap. You're kind of putting your faith in someone else to give you the room and let you get away with it. And I think Yuki, potentially could have given a bit more room. Was the one who ultimately had the ability to avoid turning it into a incident. So I think Yuki's the one that probably needs to put his hands up and say he could have done a bit of a better job in avoiding that. But I think if you make a move in that corner on lap 1 here on a super high speed track with coldish tyres, narrow confines, cars all hustling like that, you're also having a bit of a leap of faith that the other guy is going to play ball, basically.
Yeah, what I liked is looking at the stewards document, they didn't issue a penalty, and primarily I think it was because Tsunoda and Gasly themselves didn't fight it too hard. They both accepted a little bit of the blame. I think if you were going to ascribe blame, it would be to Tsunoda. But I like the fact that clearly Gasly kind of applied what I'd call a bit of racing common sense, and although he was annoyed, probably didn't think it was an argument worth having, and was willing to think, well, I was on the outside, there's a bit of a risk there. So reasonable, isn't it, Scott?
I think so. I think the Pally relationship plays into it as well. You're not being that accommodating off track with someone that you dislike or think is a dirty driver or whatever. Felt like Yuki was a little bit more, I'll do exactly the same thing again, than Gasly was, who was maybe trying to give his mate a little bit more room, quite literally on track and off it. So I struggled to see what more Gasly could have done. I mean, obviously he's the one that's put his car there, so you can argue that he instigates it effectively, but I don't think he couldn't have avoided Tsunoda anymore. It's the kind of thing that happens when you try and go side by side in Formula 1 cars through that kind of corner on the opening lap.
Exactly. Not everything has to have somebody who's blamed for it.
That's what we were saying earlier, right? Like, that's why not everything has to have a 10-second penalty chucked onto it.
Yeah, exactly. Right, let's move on now to Williams, because for the first time this season, both Williams drivers had a proper, strong, all-round weekend. What made the car so good? And has Carlos Sainz finally cracked it, given that he was the one who finished 8th, ahead of Albon?
Yeah, I think this circuit, it lacks the kind of corner that really exaggerates a Williams weakness, which is the when you're combining the braking with some steering input into the slower corners. You have a little bit of that into turn 13, the sort of the higher speed hairpin, but that's very fast, same as the last corner. That's a little bit slower. First corner is pretty much straight line braking, so it's not so much there. So I think the strengths of the car are just kind of that they can just be shown without being traded off against the weaknesses so much. It was the standout in the midfield the whole way through the weekend. They actually underachieved slightly with Alex Albon not getting to Q3. That was quickly remedied with help from that Tsunoda Gasly competition, and then just some absolutely exquisite teamwork towards the end. Something that had been not choreographed because they hadn't obviously practiced it properly, but it had been discussed in advance. They suspected they might be fighting a rearguard action against Gasly at some point. So yeah, just really, really well managed to have the cars running within DRS and then cracking on basically just to protect. It was Sainz in front of Albon, wasn't it? And then Isaac Hadjar chasing them down. So yeah, superb job from Williams. That's the kind of result that that team and that car really deserves. Haas, for example, have had a couple of big windfalls, haven't they, points-wise so far this season? But it's good to see Williams get in there with both cars when that car has been so consistently at the sharp end of the midfield.
Yeah, 25 points they're up to. Now, I did ask Alex Albon if he ever felt under any real threat from Hadjar, and he said, no, I think I had him pretty much under control, and that might not have been the case had Sainz not been willing just to back up a little bit. So very, very positive there. But we should talk briefly about Hadjar. The second time he's finished in the points after Suzuka. He's doing a good job, isn't he, John? Qualifying wasn't perfect, but the start of the race went well, executed the strategy decently, and when things come together, he's doing a good job.
Yeah, I think just consistently doing what he needs to do. I think he's shown he's got the speed in qualifying. He shows he's not had any. He's not afraid to get out there, get on with it. Put the laps in, fight as hard as he can. There's no kind of up and down roller coaster of terrible results and starring performances. Just doing a very, very solid job, chipping away, and I'm sure he's going to bring home a fair few points over the season. Just keep doing what he's doing. I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah, definitely, and good solid start after the full start of the formation lap crash in Australia. Well, let's finish off as always with some questions from the Race Members Club. If you're interested in finding out about joining, click the link in the episode description or search for the race on Patreon. There's all sorts of bonus podcasts there, exclusive videos, chats we have, early access to some content, and of course, the right to ask us questions. As ever, there's loads of them, so we'll tackle some more later in the week, but apologies that we can't possibly get through all of them in this podcast. But we'll start off with a question that Mark Hughes has answered for us from Andrea Cockrell, who said, a question for Mark Hughes: could Piastri have still won without Verstappen's penalty? And Alex Hawes asked a similar question. So here's Mark.
Could Piastri have won without the Verstappen penalty? No, I think it would have been very tough to do that, because although the McLaren was ultimately the slightly quicker car, Verstappen's track position would have meant Piastri would never be able to show that because the big advantage of dirty air. So he wouldn't have been able to undercut him at the stops. You saw how he fell away after 10 laps. So that bit of the race would have been the same. Then he wouldn't have had the pace advantage in the second stint because of the dirty air. The track advantage, Max driving off the track bottom, would have won him the race.
My next question, Scott, comes from Henrik and Tom Bannister. Could you please explain why Liam Lawson was given a 10-second penalty for the same offence in the same corner as Verstappen, who only received a 5-second time penalty?
Yeah, very simple. It happened during the Grand Prix, so they got the baseline 10-second penalty, no mitigating circumstances. Verstappen's, they said it in the stewards' verdict as well, that the 10-second baseline penalty would have been applied to Verstappen, but some leniency because it was turn one on lap one. Lawson was not afforded that because that wasn't the circumstances of his own incident.
Yeah, Lawson had finished 11th on the road. That penalty dropped him to 12th. Obviously, the pass on doing itself was fairly insignificant in his race because he was coming through a slower car, but cost him one place.
It's a shame because I actually thought this was a much better weekend for Lawson. He obviously found himself shuffled back behind Hadjar on the opening lap, but he'd had Hadjar's number, I think, and pieced it together nicely in qualifying. He was a 10th away from Q3, and I thought if a Racing Bulls was going to sneak a point, it would have been him. I think this was his best level of performance so far, but yeah, got a bit messy in the middle of the Grand Prix, and it's just one where the end result looks a little bit worse as a result of that, plus the fact he's finished behind his teammate who's managed to nab a point just reflects a bit worse. But I think we are starting to see the best of Lawson in F1 again. Well,
that's related to the question that you've got next, John, from Mark Andrews, saying another race, another penalty for Lawson, but his pace at the end of the Grand Prix seems strong and he out-qualified a teammate for the first time in a while. Is this the light at the end of the tunnel for Lawson?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's really hard to see the progress of drivers in that midfield just based on the final positions. I think things are so ridiculously close now that if you're a 10th off in the wrong session or you make the tiniest of errors, the entire weekend can kind of spiral a little bit out of control. And, Lawson yesterday, 1/10 of a second would have been into Q3. Then I think the whole race plays out in a completely different way. Different strategies, different result at the end of it. So I think he's been chipping away. He's obviously had a very difficult start to the season. The Red Bull disaster. Then I think it wasn't easy for him getting thrust into a new team amid the triple header. Things coming at him super, super fast. But I think he's getting there. I think he's getting there slowly. He seems more confident and happy in himself. I think he's understanding more this car. And I think slowly he'll get there. And I'm sure he too will join Hadjar in delivering some points for Racing Bulls.
Next question I'll take from Jake Wilkinson. How impressed have you been with Isaac Hadjar? For someone who felt like he gained his seat by default, he's been incredibly impressive. Yeah, on this question, I really wanted to pick up on that point about gained his seat by default, because yes, there was seemingly extreme reluctance from Red Bull to put him in. They kind of had to put him in once they'd moved Perez out and promoted Lawson, albeit temporarily. He finished second in F2. There were some questions about his overall sort of approach and under pressure and that radio communication. But I think he's really shown that it was the right decision to promote him, and he's now moved from somebody who I think some were rather unfairly just assuming would be the next bit of cannon fodder for Red Bull into someone who's actually going somewhere in F1, which is mission accomplished for him in the first 5 races, and all credit to him. In particular, this was an impressive race because I don't think he really could have done better than 10th. Similar story in Japan when he was 7th. So, very positive start. Right, another question now for Mark from Stevie Noises. This sounds like a criticism, but it isn't intended to be. Why does the race practice analysis compare unfavourably against the real results? McLaren was predicted to be 0.3 seconds per lap quicker in qualifying and 0.7 in the race. They didn't get pole and had nowhere near that sort of advantage in the race. What changed? I think you can see why I had to throw this one at Mark Hughes, who always does our practice analysis. Let's hear his excuses.
On the Friday practice piece, well, it's called the Friday practice analysis. It's supposed to be an analysis of what has happened thus far. And yes, there's some predictive value in that, but it's not pretending to be a prediction. There are far too many variables that can happen, such as, does Red Bull finally get the car into the sweet spot from Friday to Saturday like it had in Suzuka? Or is the car completely unresponsive like it was in Bahrain? No way of knowing that. Does Ferrari finally switch on the new floor with a new understanding? Or is it, does it turn out that there's a more fundamental problem than that? Does somebody crash? Does the track temperature change? And what effect does that have on each car's balance? Those things are just the variables that are in the future, and it's a waste of time talking about those because they could go anyway. And the premise is that the readers should understand that those are the normal things, the normal variables in the way the weekend develops. So it's not trying to predict. It's saying that, yes, on Friday, the advantage of the McLaren was, in this case, 3/10 on a qualifying lap. And looking at the DRS traces, it looks like they're running a comparable power mode to the Red Bull. And historically, the fuel loads between the two teams don't vary. So we can say that with a fair degree of certainty on that Friday, on that day, that's how much faster the McLaren was than the Red Bull. And you then get that backed up with the relative performances in the long runs. But that's not saying, so it will be exactly like this on Saturday. There's no intention for it to be a prediction in that way, and it can't be. So that's the reason.
Right, good stuff from Mark. On now to one for you, Scott, from Dan Lyons. Is Lando Norris's racecraft sharp enough? I believe he missed out on a podium today after wasting 2 laps battling with Hamilton, which should have been a straightforward DRS pass. Had he not lost those 2 laps, do you think he would have probably caught and passed Leclerc at the end? And there was a similar question from Alex Hinley and Dan W.
Yeah, so not to be short with the question, But I obviously talked about it a little bit earlier on. I probably should have read your outline better, Ed, and realised that this question was coming. But yeah, I think Norris didn't execute his recovery drive as well as he could have done. I said earlier, like, it could have cost him a podium, or maybe I said it did cost him. It is hard to say definitively, because catching a car is one thing, passing them is another, and Leclerc was a car that had a friendlier tyre delta to Norris than, say, the others that Norris was catching and passing. But I think he'd have had a better chance, because obviously he did get tucked up behind him for the last few laps, and he should have put, even if he couldn't definitely have got past, he should have put himself in the best position possible to do that, and the way to do that would have been obviously to then pressure Leclerc for longer towards the back end of the race. So yeah, can't say for certain that he would have been on the podium really, but I think he definitely could have done a slightly better job with the Hamilton pass and just making sure that he got as far forward as quickly as possible.
Next one for you, John, from Ben. The Red Bull puzzles me. Is it on a par with the McLaren on a track like this, or does Max simply extract 100% from the car, but the McLaren drivers don't?
I think the Red Bull puzzles Red Bull, to be honest. It's been, I think someone in the Verstappen camp has called it a bit of a diva in some respects. But I think it's primarily based on its characteristics, that, you've got a broad spectrum of different track types, different track surfaces, different temperatures. And I think you can now kind of tick some boxes as to what this car likes. It likes cooler temperatures. So while the daytime here was super, super hot, as the evenings came away, it wasn't so horrendous. So that partly helped. And we saw in Japan, when things are cool, it's better. It likes low-speed corners. We saw that in Japan especially, where it was murdering the McLaren in the hairpin and the chicane. Very critical. But it especially loves high speed. It's super, super comfortable in high-speed corners. It manages to kind of transition through these corners very, very well. And this is primarily what the Jeddah track's made up of. So that explains its performance here. Where it's horrible is in medium speed corners, where a big change of direction, where the through corner balance is completely at sea, and they're really struggling to work out what's happening, how do they cure it, how do they not compromise the pace, and that remains a big headache. And that was the problem in Bahrain. So you mix all these elements together, you can see why Max Verstappen won in a cold Japan. You can see why it was so difficult in a very warm Bahrain, and you can kind of work out why they were a match with McLaren on a high-speed, warm but not too hot Jeddah. And I think then you take these elements and you can try and kind of plot your way forwards. And I think kind of a medium speedish hot Miami may probably not be too ideal for them.
Next question I'll take from Shirag Shah. No one is speaking about Lance Stroll doing a pretty good job on the hards for 40 laps or so. What I don't understand is that why Aston would then put him out on a set of mediums versus softs. Clearly, I thought that was their end game, running him for so long, but was disappointed to see that it didn't happen. Though his pace wasn't great, it wasn't terrible either, and it showed that those hards could be managed. Again, not a Stroll fan by any means, but really questioning Aston's questionable strategies race after race. Well, ultimately, Stroll wasn't the one who went furthest on the hards. Ocon did. He did 49 laps. Bortoletto also, like Ocon, stopped on lap 1 and went to the end, but he was lapped, so he did 1 lap less. So Stroll didn't actually go the furthest on the hards. He did a perfectly decent job. He was within a tenth of Alonso in qualifying and got eliminated in Q1, but that was just a small margin on the wrong side of the split compared to Alonso. Perfectly decent race. The reason Aston did it was there was no hope of getting into the points without some assistance, so they just left him out there, hope for a safety car. That was the mission. Stroll did it, and then when they stopped, the softs wouldn't have been a good race tyre, so they did put him on mediums. The race was gone by the time they stopped, really, anyway, so it made zero difference in that regard. But I don't think that was a bad strategy from Aston. They raced sort of properly and normally and conventionally with Alonso, and Stroll was the Hail Mary, which he did as well as he could have done on.
Yeah, he was on a hiding it to nothing. If you don't get outside assistance, so the one safety car that did occur came at the wrong time for him. So just never getting anywhere. This was a bad one for Aston Martin, because it should have been a track that suited them a little bit better. If it did suit them a little bit better, then it didn't really show in the results. I said that I think Alonso's in for a very long season of near misses of points, and I think his qualifying result was so fitting, because he was basically in a proper no man's land in 13th, I think he was, where he was like a tenth and a half off the group of cars that was separated by a tenth around the Q3 cutoff, but it was also a tenth or two clear of the Q2 stragglers. And that's just so Alonso in the Aston Martin, isn't it? But on the Stroll Q1 exit, obviously, he got the quote-unquote honour of the new record for most Q1 exits this weekend, but which obviously I'm sure a lot of people have had some fun with it as a headline stat, but actually thought this was a very unfortunate qualifying session for Stroll to pick up that record in, because as you said, Ed, he was within a tenth of Alonso, and that's the kind of thing where if that's the difference between you getting out of Q2, getting out of Q1 into Q2 or not, like, yes, you can be hypercritical and say you need to be on the right side of those margins, and maybe Stroll isn't on the right side of those often enough, but this wasn't one like in recent weeks where he's been nowhere and is half a second off or something like that, right? Like he was fine. It's just this is the car he's driving at the moment. It is a Q1, Q2 marginal car, and Fernando's just better at getting the most out of it than Lance is.
Next question from Martin Kane for you, Scott. What do you make of Jack Doohan's race? We lost the reference with Gasly early on, so there was no reference. Nevertheless, his race seemed pretty underwhelming, besides the on-the-finish-line pass on Gabriel Bortoleto to avoid last place.
Another driver on a hiding to nothing. Did an unorthodox strategy, switching to the hards at the start and running extremely long just to see if they could do something that way. This is not a track that you want to be driving an Alpine on in a race, because I think it's one of the absolute hardest, might be a top 3 track in terms of the lack of opportunity there is to charge the battery. We know that that's a big weakness on the Alpine that shows up more in race trim than qualifying trim. So Doohan was a bit off it this weekend. He didn't feel particularly comfortable. By the time he felt like he'd got in a little bit more of a groove with it, it was qualifying. That's a bit too late. So he was in a bad position. He had a bit of a Hail Mary strategy, and he had a car that wasn't going to be particularly much fun to race in. So yeah, just no surprise that he ended up having to do the second stop. At least he was able to finish the race with a flourish, but it won't be, of the few races he's done so far in Formula 1, this isn't one that he had much to write home about in.
John, the last question that we'll throw at you for this podcast is from David Sayer. Many in the media said it was hard to overtake here, but we saw quite a few overtakes. What was the reason behind this?
Long DRS zones, basically. It's a track that there aren't super tons of heavy braking places, which normally are the place to do passes. There's turn 1, but out the back, the slipstream's good, the DRS is good, the car ahead of you, because the energy management requirements here sometimes doesn't have a lot of power left to defend when they're in front from someone attacking with DRS. So it's just a track that does actually work quite well for overtaking, and much better than some places we've had, like Japan, for example, where there was virtually no chance to get super close to people. It's a layout that works, even if the overtakes are fairly straightforward DRS overtakes. Apart from, I thought Oscar Piastri's move on Lewis Hamilton today was exceptional, because he wasted absolutely no time in muscling his way past in a place that not many people overtake around here.
And the final question for the podcast overall that I will take comes from Urban Motobike. What was behind Lewis Hamilton's lack of pace? Rear instability? Tyres? ? Well, we'll probably talk about Hamilton in the midweek podcast in depth, but I'll give the short version. It was pretty much everything, really. He came into the weekend very confident that the lessons that he learned in that second stint, in particular in Bahrain, on driving technique could be applicable globally, and he was going to work on those, and he was pleased with the upgrade and thought he'd take the step. Then Friday he wasn't very happy at all. He was saying, I'm just trying to get into the top 10 at the moment. Saturday, qualifying didn't go that well. He said that back to the drawing board when the question was put to him about the technique things he learned from Bahrain and how applicable they were. And then the race, yeah, he did struggle a bit with the tyres. I mean, he is struggling a little bit with rear instability, but also just across the board confidence like that. There were a number of moments in qualifying when turn 1 went a little bit wrong just because of a little bit of uncertainty, a couple of bites at turning in. He's looking at Leclerc and saying, yeah, he's nailed the driving style for this car and he's got the experience here. I need to adapt. The really interesting thing was several times he said, I know I need to adapt. I've tried to adapt the car, but it won't go there. I know I need to adapt what I'm doing, and maybe I'm just a bit too set in my ways, was sort of one of the comments, to paraphrase, he made. So that's his challenge. And yeah, it's been a very mixed bag the first part of the season. And yeah, tough tough for him and a lot for him to go away and digest and learn, because he was a clear step behind Leclerc, and probably he's at his worst when it comes to that last one in Q3, and you've got to absolutely nail it, because that's where he just pushes at the entries a little bit too hard in some of the corners, can't do his old driving style and struggles. So that's the short version. I'm sure we'll get into a slightly more in-depth version soon. Before we finish up, it's giveaway time again, and if you've been unlucky claiming one of our codes to get a free month of access to the Race Members Club up to now, you're in luck, because the first 50 people who claim it via the brand new link you can find in the description of this episode will get a free month of access. So act fast to make sure you don't miss out, and we look forward to seeing you in our community very soon. So thanks to everyone who sent in questions for this podcast. Thanks to John. Thanks to Scott. Thanks to everyone for sticking with us through this latest triple header. But the paddock never really sleeps, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.
Support for this podcast and the following message is brought to you by E-Trade from Morgan Stanley. With E-Trade, you can dive into the market with easy-to-use tools, $0 commissions, and a wide range of investments. And now there's even more to love. Get access to industry-leading research and insights from Morgan Stanley to help guide your decisions. Open an account and get up to $1,000 or more with a qualifying deposit. Get started today at etrade.com. Terms and other fees apply. Investing involves risks. Morgan Stanley Smith Barney, LLC. Member SIPC. E-Trade is a business of Morgan Stanley.
As we head into the playoffs, it's safe to assume there will be a few calls made by the refs that will be hard to accept. But you know what isn't hard to accept? Discover. Believe it or not, Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. You heard that right, 99%. So make a good call for your wallet and get Discover. Based on the February 2024 Nielsen report, learn more at discover.com/creditcard.
How can you grow your business from idea to industry leader? Bring your vision to life with smart business buying tools and technology from Amazon Business. From fast, free shipping to in-depth buying insights and automated purchase approvals, we deliver everything you need to achieve your goals. It's not easy to stand out from the crowd. Simplify how you stock up to get ahead. Go to amazonbusiness.com for support.